The United States national debt just crossed $34 trillion. And if you're waiting to feel that number in your daily life, you probably haven't. Gas is still gas. Rent is still due on the 1st. Nothing about your morning changed the day that number ticked over. So here's the question almost nobody asks out loud. If $34 trillion of debt were actually dangerous, wouldn't we feel it by now? Well, here's what almost nobody says out loud. You're not wrong to notice that nothing's happened, but you're wrong if you think that means nothing will. Because debt like this doesn't work like a light switch. It works more like a bill on autopay. The charge is already happening in the background. You just haven't opened the statement yet.
So let's open the statement, because the number that actually matters here isn't 34 trillion. It's the interest on that 34 trillion. Last year, the federal government spent more than $1 trillion just paying interest on the debt it already owes. Not new spending, not a new program, just the cost of carrying debt that already exists. And to put that in perspective, that's now more than the entire annual defense budget. The United States is now spending more on interest payments than on the military. Let that sit for a second, because that wasn't true a few years ago.
And it's not slowing down. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest payments will keep climbing every single year for the next decade, even if the government doesn't borrow another additional dollar for anything new. Just the existing debt at current rates on autopay. Because here's the mechanic almost nobody explains. The government doesn't pay off old debt, it rolls it over. It issues new bonds to pay off the old ones as they come due. And as long as interest rates stay low, rolling that debt over is cheap and easy. But interest rates went up sharply over the past few years, which means every time a chunk of old, cheap debt comes due, it gets replaced with new, more expensive debt. The debt itself doesn't change. What it costs to carry it does. So think of it like a credit card. Imagine you have a card with a massive balance, but for years, the interest rate was basically zero. You could carry that balance forever, and it barely cost you anything. That's roughly what the government was doing for over a decade. But now, imagine your credit card company suddenly moves your rate up sharply, and every payment period, more of your old 0% balance gets refinanced at the new, much higher rate. Nothing about how much you originally spent changed, but the cost of carrying it just went up dramatically, and it keeps compounding. That's the situation the federal government is in right now, just at a scale of trillions instead of thousands. And here's where it starts to become your problem, even if you've never thought about the national debt for a single second in your life. Because every dollar the government spends on interest is a dollar that isn't available for anything else. It has to come from somewhere, either from higher taxes down the road, from cuts to programs people actually rely on, or from even more borrowing, which just makes next year's interest bill even bigger. There isn't a fourth option. The money has to come from one of those three places, and all three of them eventually touch regular people. Now, back to the debt. Because there's a name economists use for this exact dynamic. It's called the debt spiral, and it works like this. Higher interest costs mean the government has to borrow more just to cover those interest payments. Borrowing more increases the total debt. A bigger total debt means even more interest owed next year, and around it goes. It's not a guaranteed collapse. Plenty of countries have carried high debt loads for a long time without a crisis. But it is a mechanical loop that gets harder to slow down the longer it runs, especially once interest costs start eating into a large share of the entire budget. Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, has been uncharacteristically direct about this. He stated publicly that the U.S. federal government is on an unsustainable fiscal path, and that dealing with it sooner rather than later would be far less painful than waiting. So if interest alone isn't a five-alarm fire yet, why do economists keep bringing up debt-to-GDP ratios like they matter? Because that ratio is really just a measure of how much debt the economy can comfortably carry relative to its size. Right now, that ratio is higher than it's been in most of modern U.S. history, rivaling levels last seen right after World War II.
The difference is, after World War II, the ratio came down steadily for decades as the economy grew. Right now, it's projected to keep climbing instead, because unlike back then, there isn't a clear plan in place to bring it back down. Here's the part that makes all of this feel invisible day to day. Debt problems rarely show up as a single dramatic moment. Nobody wakes up one morning to a headline that says the debt broke the economy. Instead, it shows up gradually and indirectly. It shows up as a government that has less room to respond the next time there's a real recession, because so much of the budget is already locked into interest payments. It shows up as slower growth over time, if economists are right that heavy government borrowing competes with private investment for the same pool of capital. And it shows up as harder choices in Washington, where every dollar spent on interest is a dollar that has to be justified against a program that actually helps someone.
Think of it less like a bomb and more like an iceberg. Almost all of the actual mass is sitting below the surface, where you can't see it, quietly displacing everything around it, long before anything visible breaks through the waterline. And that's really the uncomfortable part of this story. It's not that the debt is fake or that it doesn't matter, and it's not that collapse is guaranteed either. It's that the consequences are already happening, just not in a form dramatic enough to make the evening news. Higher interest costs are already crowding out other spending, right now, today, in this year's budget. The bill's already being paid. It's just being paid quietly, a little bit at a time, instead of all at once. Before we wrap up, I want to know where you land on this. Do you think this actually gets addressed at some point, or does the number just keep climbing? Drop a comment and let me know what you think happens from here. Because when you zoom out, this is the real story underneath the $34 trillion headline. National debt like this doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It quietly changes what a government can afford, one interest payment at a time, until one day, the bill that's been building in the background finally lands on somebody's desk. The debt didn't show up out of nowhere. It's been on autopay the whole time. We just hadn't opened the statement yet.